This is 11 honors lit. We're finishing up Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is the last chapter. It's Dr. Jekyll's letter that explains everything, and it's after the action in the story is ended. So the action is that Dr. Jekyll, or Mr. Hyde, is dead, dressed in the clothes of Dr. Jekyll, and the story is basically over, but now he's explaining it. So
what page?
it's page 68 at the bottom of the page. The one thing at the beginning that I wanted you to note was that as he thought of the idea of splitting himself into two people, that's not really what he's doing. He's not splitting himself. He's making two people out of one. And the reason he wants to do that is why? Why does he want to be two people?
So he doesn't like it.
One at a time. I can't hear you.
Well, he doesn't want to just like make a mix. He wants to express himself as one person at one time, and then express himself as Mr. Hyde.
So Mr. Hyde is all evil, and Dr. Jekyll is a mixture of good and evil. He can live with that, but he wants to be all evil because he wants to enjoy being evil without being caught. And there's no way anybody's going to catch him. Well, if they could catch Mr. Hyde, but he immediately can become Dr. Jekyll again. So it's a perfect, if you could do it, it's the perfect mask. It's the perfect disguise. And so he's explaining what led to this, and he's why is Mr. Hyde smaller and younger than Dr. Jekyll?
He hasn't had as much experience being evil.
That's right. The evil in him is younger and less experienced than the good. So that's the pure evil of him is smaller, represents kind of he's not as experienced in that. So he is now. Oh, he just experienced the first time that he went to bed as one and woke up as the other without taking the medicine. So that tells us that at some point the drug was taking over, and it wasn't Dr. Jekyll anymore that was in charge. It was the drug that was doing its own thing. So he goes to bed. Now they hear Henry Jekyll. So he went to bed as Hyde, but somehow he woke up as Jekyll, and he doesn't know why. So make sure your questions out there, and let's finish. It's just about 10 pages. Not quite.
Most of the stairs. Is that where we're at?
Must have stairs, yeah.
What if he was like doing a murder
Guys, this is something.
and like midway through the murder he like turned back into Jekyll?
Oh, that could have happened. That's what's happening now. He doesn't have any way of controlling it. He doesn't know when it's going to happen. So that could happen. Joe.
Most of the stairs wanted for near half a minute. Some as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast, the sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals. And bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror.
Now remember, he woke up as Dr. Jekyll. He went to bed as Mr. Hyde, so he's looking to find a mirror to see who he is.
At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde.
Okay, I just got that completely opposite. It's the other way around. That makes more sense, because that would be more startling. He's safe when he wakes up as Jekyll, but his point is he didn't. He went to bed as Jekyll, woke up as Hyde.
How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then, with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up, all my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, to the back passage, across the open court, through the anatomical theater, from where I was then standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed as well as I was able, and closed my own eyes. had soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour, and in such a strange array. And 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down, with a darkened brow, to make a feint of breakfasting.
And so the problem is if he goes to bed as Dr. Jekyll and wakes up as Mr. Hyde, the clothes don't fit. He looks ridiculous. And so, but he also realized they're used to seeing Mr. Hyde here, so he can go around, he can walk around as Mr. Hyde without them being shocked. If he's not reading more, you'll go ahead.
Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversible of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment, and I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger that, if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown. The power voluntarily changed be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become
Irrevocably.
mine. The power of its grasp had not been always equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then, I have been obliged on more than one occasion to double and once, with infinite risk of death, to trouble the amount and the rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second works.
You see what he's saying? He's really becoming Hyde, not Jekyll. And now it's reversed the way it was. He was before trying to take on the body of Hyde. Now he has to work at taking on the body of Jekyll. So the drug now is kind of used to get back on where he is. I don't know what it would be like to be addicted to something. I think we all are addicted to some degree. You're used to like things at home, and you go to vacation, and you're used to whatever it is, and you miss it, and you're just not as comfortable. That's not really addiction, but that's the way it feels, I'm sure, the way Dr. Jekyll feels, that he now can't control this thing. It was great as long as he could control it. He could be bad, but now when he can't control it, it's controlling him. It's not as much fun anymore. And I imagine that's why, say, drug addicts, but you can be addicted to a whole bunch of things. When you realize, I'm not in control of this, it's dictating to me what to do. And suddenly, you don't like that. And it's hard to get people unaddicted to things, I'm sure. Thanks.
Between these two, I now felt that I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were more unequal, shared between them. Jekyll, who was
Composite.
now with the more sensitive apprehensions, now a greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern, in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites, which I had long secretly indulged and had of late began to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die to a thousand interests and
preferred the elderly and discontented doctor. Surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and obeyed to resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, leaping impulses and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. I had made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained, and enjoyed the compensations of an improving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my love. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once compounded and swallowed the transforming draught.
So he tried to stay away from it for 2 months, and he couldn't, so he went back to taking the medicine. You want to read?
Is it between?
I do not suppose.
I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is 1 out of 500. He is 1 out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, good enough allowance for the complete moral instability and instant readiness to evil, which were the leading characteristics of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. But my devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious even when I took the draught of a more unbrewed, a more furious propensity.
Right.
What's that?
Propensity is a tendency to do something.
To ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul, that tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare at last before God, no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child made rude a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case to be tempted, however slightly was
So he actually, this is when he killed Sir Danvers. He had tried to stay away from the stuff for about 2 months. He couldn't. So once he was back in the shape of Mr. Hyde, he killed Sir Danvers. It's like he was angry at having him pent up all these months. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me in rage with a transport of glee. I mauled the unresisting body. So when he ran over Sir Danvers, it's like he couldn't stop himself. He just hit and he just kept going, tasting delight from every blow. It was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck down the heart of by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeited and fled from the scene of those excesses, at once glorifying and trembling. My lust of evil gratified and stimulated. I'll make sure I'm on the right. My lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed to the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho, and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers, thence to set out through the lamp-lit streets. In the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating on my crime, lightheartedly devising others in the future, and yet hastening and still heartening to my wait for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him, for Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of my childhood, when I had walked with my father's hand, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality through the damned horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me. But still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or not, I was now confided to the better part of my existence. And how, oh, how I rejoiced to think of it. With willing humility, I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With what the sincere reunification, I locked the door by which I'd gone forth and come and ground the key under my heel. So he kills Sir Danvers, decides he's never going to do that again. Ben, you got a book with it. Bottom of 72. The next day.
The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus, buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take and slay him.
Thanks. Brian.
I resolved in my future conduct to regain the past, and I can say honestly that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself now earnestly in the last months of the last year I labored to relieve sufferings. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Nor can I truly say that I weary of this beneficent and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but I was stirred first with my duality of purpose. And as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me so long endured, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde, the bare idea of that was sorrowful to think of. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience, and it was an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation.
There comes an end to all things, the most capacious measure is filled at last, and the brief condescension to my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day. Wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead. And Regis Park was full of winter cherries and sweet with spring odors. I sat in the sun on a bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, browsing subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected I was like my neighbors, and then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me in pain, and then as it turned faintness subsided, I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a gratefulness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down, my clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken was courted and hairy. I was more like Edward Hyde. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, all people loved. The cloth laying for me in the dining room at home, and now I was the common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows.
All right, so here, I want you to note this. I don't seem to have a question about this. So I need to ask you to write, make a note of it. You're going to be required to know it. It says that he's on a park bench in the sun as Mr. Dr. Jekyll, and he suddenly, in public, becomes Mr. Hyde. It's the first time this has happened, in public. He's in a public place. I don't know if anybody sees the change, but they see the result of the change. And I want you to make note of this. What is he thinking about at the time? I'm going to ask you this question. So here's the answer. He says, after all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors. And then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at this very moment, that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a hard nausea, and the most deadly shuddering. So he was thinking that he was better than other men. He was proud. He was sitting there in the park as Dr. Jekyll, being proud. This is not one of the questions, but you need to know the answer. And it's that point that, why do you think that is? The fact that he was thinking he was better than other men as Dr. Jekyll. What's the significance that he changed into Mr. Hyde at that moment? Yeah.
I think Mr. Talbot said something about like pride being the root of all sins or something.
Pride.
So
Yeah, there's a story in the Bible about Nebuchadnezzar, and he's on top of his palace, and he's saying, look at my kingdom. This is the greatest kingdom in the world. At that moment, he was struck down with some mental illness that for, I think, 7 years, he acted like an animal, literally. He got his mind back after about 7 years. So, yeah, there's something about at that moment of pride. Be careful. Look for the thunderbolt, the lightning bolt, because that's not a good place to be. I'm better than you. And all of a sudden, something bad happens to him. So why don't we go to Julia?
My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that, in my second character, my faculties seemed sharpened to a point and my spirit more intensely elastic. Thus it became about that, where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed, I grasped the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. A laboratory door I had closed. If I had sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand and thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Something that I escaped capture in the streets. How was I to make my way into his presence? And how should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part remained to me. I could write my own hand, and once I had conceived that kindling spark, the way that I must follow became lighted up in pen.
So why can't he did this before. Remember, he turned into Mr. Hyde at home, and so he walked around his house, and servants saw him. So now he's become Mr. Hyde in public on a bench. Why can't he go home and like he did before and ask and get the medicine? He needs the medicine to change back. Why can't he do that?
people would follow him.
Why?
Because he's a murderer.
He's what?
They know he's a murderer.
Exactly. He's wanted for murder. He's like FBI's #1 most wanted, just walking back home and saying, okay, I'm back. They know he did the murder. And so anybody here in the park, if they see him, they could call the police, because I don't know that they know what he looks like. But he can't do that. So he's got to figure out some way to get his medicine without actually going home as Mr. Hyde. And of course, that was where Lanyon came in. He's gonna ask Lanyon to do it. And remember, Lanyon saw, well, you'll find that out, Lanyon actually sees Hyde turn back into Jekyll. He saw that process, and that's what killed him, ultimately. Why don't, Robbie, why don't you pick it up there?
Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best I could, and summoning a passing hansom, drove to a hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced, however, at my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however, attractive to pay these promised covered. The driver could not conceal it. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face. Happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for another instant I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so as made that not a look that they
Obsequiously.
obsequiously took my orders out of the private room and brought me where with all its right. Died in danger of his life was a creature shaken with inward anger, strong to the pitch of murder, destined to inflict pain, yet the creature was sweet, mastered his fury with the great effort of the will. Composed his two important letters, one to Lanyon and one to me, that he might receive actual evidence of their guilt, posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing his nails, there behind, sitting alone with his fears, like whether visibly quailing before his eyes and then when the night was fully come, he set forth in the corner of the closed cab and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. He, I say, I cannot say. The child of hell had nothing lived in him but fear of nature, and when at last the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, tired in his misfitting clothes, not of his worked out observation, into the midst of the nocturnal passengers. These feverish passions raged within him like a tempest. Walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minute that divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled.
So he has to figure out a way to do it, so remember, he writes Lanyon and tells him to do it for him, and he's gonna go to Lanyon and get it. And this woman just happened to say something to him, and he slapped her in the face, so he's very violent man. Yeah.
When I came to myself at Lanyon, the horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I did not know, it was at least but a drop in the sea to the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. The change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows, it was the horror of being Hyde direct. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came home to my own house and got into bed. Slept after the frustration of the day, a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could avail to break. I woke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before. But I was once more at home, in my own house and close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost rivaled the brightness of home.
Thank him.
I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that herald the change, and I gained the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of pride. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall to myself in the last 6 hours after, as I was sitting sadly in the fire, the pangs be brimming with the image of terror, a soul boiling with costless hatreds, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energy of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of this vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature that shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the most poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish but ignorant, inorganic.
Okay, why don't you stop there? We almost can finish it, so I'd like to try.
This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust and gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead and had no shape should usurp the offices of life. And this again, that insurgent horror was knit to him closer than away, closer than his eye, lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and felt it struggle to be born. And at every hour of weakness and in the confidence of slumber prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was of a different order. His terror of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide and return to the subordinate station of a part instead of a person, which Jekyll was now fallen, and he resented the dislike. But he loathed the necessity, he loathed the despondency into which Jekyll had fallen, and he resented the dislike which he was himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and restoring the fortune of my father, and indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have returned himself in order to involve me in the rule. But his love of life is wonderful. I go further. I who sicken and freeze with mere thought of him, when I recall the objection and passion of his attachment, and when I know how he feared my power to cut him off by suicide, I find it in my heart to pity.
It is useless and time awfully fails me to prolong this description. No one has ever suffered such torments like that suffice, and yet even these have it brought not elevation, but a certain costliness of soul and certain accusance of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, but from the last county, which has now fallen, which has finally severed me from my own face and nature, my provision of the soul has never been renewed since the day of the first experiment.
Hey, would you circle the word salt? That was the thing that ironically was missing, or wasn't missing, but the salt he was now using wasn't as powerful as the salt he originally used, so it's not working. And we'll have to stop here. I know we're almost finished, but we're not quite. So we'll finish this Wednesday, read Romans 8, prepare for the test on Friday. I'll bring it. I've got a copy for you. I'll wait just a minute. Hang on.
If you are in the homeroom SLT, please check your email at the end of the day for an important message from Connect. Homeroom SLT, check your email for a message from Connect. Have a good day.
I will see you. See, yeah.
I just show you this before spring break. I got the vocab printed out.
Yeah.
And even if I'm not gonna get credit, I just wanted to show you. print's double-sided.
Okay, alright. Alright, I got you. You have a good break?
I did. I got to go up to Virginia, see my baby cousins.
Yeah, where do they live?
What?
Where do they live?
Fredericksburg area.
Okay, it's not too far, is it?
It's a couple hours. It's not too bad.
I'm glad you were, yeah, we didn't get out of town. Summer will be here, we'll get out. Alright, see you.
Have a good one.
You too, thanks.
Nunez, 25, driving a Mercedes erratically without headlights in and around the Patchogue area. Anyways, Mercedes was pulled over. Nunez got out of the vehicle, began fighting with the officer in the front yard of a home. During the confrontation, the officer was stabbed in the leg, hitting an artery. Two good Samaritans thankfully responded and got officers, Dr. over in Seattle